buenas tardes. Good evening. Welcome to the last lecture about bilingualism, this series that started last year and which has been, we are very happy because it has been a real success due to the cooperation and really excellent work of Dr. Julio Villa Garcia. Thank you, Julio. Welcome. And welcome also Cecile de Cat, who will be the lecture tonight, with a lecture about the understanding the diversity of pupils' bilingual experiences. This series, as you might know, most of you, because we know that we have quite a lot of people who are following, if not the whole series, but most of the lectures. But the aim of the series is to show and to explain from the best experts' point of view and analysis and studies how important is multilingualism, bilingualism, and far from being a disadvantage or something that might confuse, that was the traditional idea some time ago about bilingualism, to educate children in 2 or even more languages. The contrary is that it helps in many aspects, the capacity of analysis and to adaptability also to different cultural realities. So in that sense, considering that the aim of the Cervantes Institute is to promote the Hispanic language, the Spanish language and the Hispanic culture in the world, so we are very happy because in that sense, bilingualism is part of what we do also in Instituto Cervantes, where we promote and we teach not only Spanish, but also the official languages in Spain, Catalan, Basque, and Galician. And we have also the experiences in many countries where Instituto Cervantes can also learn the local language in that aim of the cultural dialogue and the promotion of multilingualism. Let me introduce our special guest tonight is Dr. Cecile de Cat, who is professor of linguistics at the University of Leeds. Welcome, Cecile, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Most of her research focuses on language development in monolingual and multilingual children and in multilingual adults. The topics or the questions of this interest include what aspects of language are more difficult to learn or to acquire, also easier to forget or to lose, what predicts better, faster language outcomes in children, how the heritage of the mother tongue language or bilingual children scaffolds their acquisition in English. So those questions are the main topics of the work of Professor de Cat. And at the moment, he is currently leading on projects to create online tools to document bilingual children's languages experiences, also to assess core languages skills as KS 3 and KS 4, and to understand individual variation in heritage language acquisition and maintenance. For all those studies, those research projects, the online tools, you can have access to the internet, and maybe we can share that also in our chat. So you might be some of you interested to have access to this wonderful work. The coordinator of the series is Dr. Julio Villa Garcia, who is currently a senior lecturer in Spanish linguistics and syntax, in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at the University of Manchester. And at the moment, he is a Maria Zambrano senior researcher at his alma mater, the University of Oviedo in Asturias in northern Spain, where, by the way, there is also local languages, Bable, who is spoken by a certain part of the population. Dr. Villagarcia, in the course of his PhD at the University of Connecticut, was trained as a theoretical syntactician and also as a language acquisitionist, working within the framework of minimalism. His current interests lie in the areas of Spanish Romance and English linguistics. Other interests include child language acquisition, bilingualism, and the application of theoretical linguistic research to foreign second language pedagogy. So thank you very much, Dr. Cat, Dr. Villagarcia, for being with us. Let me remind you that at the end, we will have some time, 10, 15 minutes for questions and answers that you can put on the chat, and Dr. Villagarcia will put on our special guest tonight. And also, I would like to comment that due to the success of this program, bilingualism, or those 2 last years, we will continue next year, and soon we will start publishing the program for 2023. Thank you very much for being with us, to our public, and the floor is yours, Julio. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you very much, everyone. You've been very loyal to the series, and it's very nice to see that the Institute is willing to continue with the series for a new edition next year. So as you know, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Pedro, I'm Julio Villagarcia from the University of Manchester, and currently from the University of Oviedo, actually, here in Spain. And it's a great honor for me to introduce our speaker today, Professor Cecile de Cat, who will be delivering the lecture, Understanding the Diversity of Pupils' Bilingual Experiences. This is the 5th talk of the 2022 edition, the 2nd edition of the Bilingualism series of the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester and Leeds. Professor de Cat studied Romance philology at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. She studied linguistics at Durham and then worked as a research assistant in York, where she also undertook a PhD in the field of language acquisition. She then started lecturing at Leeds, where she has been ever since. And in fact, since the year 2015, she has been full professor of linguistics there. At the same time, Professor de Cat is professor too at the Arctic University of Norway, more commonly known as Tromsø. She champions the Speech and Language Action Project Group at the Centre for Applied Education Research, which is operative nationwide in the UK. As far as her scholarly production is concerned, Professor de Cat has focused on several areas within the field of linguistics. Pedro Eusebio Cuesta has mentioned a few, but I'll mention the main ones here. Language acquisition, both first and second language acquisition, including bilingualism, second language processing, information structure and its interaction with syntax, namely how the information is packaged in a sentence, old versus new information, and the ordering of such elements, corpus-based and experimental studies, as well as statistical modeling. Okay, she's the author of countless publications, all of which are very influential, both in the areas of syntax and language acquisition, including bilingualism. Well, I could spend the whole hour introducing our renowned and distinguished professor, but since we are here to listen to Cecile de Cat, I want to ask you to join me in welcoming her without further ado. Many thanks, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you very much, Professor de Cat. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pedro and Julio, for these really kind introductions. So I'll just start sharing my screen. In the UK, children's bilingualism is officially recorded as English as an additional language, EAL. So this is a binary distinction, and you see that the definition as given by the Department for Education is that a pupil has a status of EAL if they're exposed to a language at home that is known or believed to be other than English. So you see it's quite loose, but it's also very strict, very rough in a sense. It's like a binary distinction. And this binary distinction doesn't tell us very much, actually nothing at all, about the diversity of bilingual children's language experience. And that diversity is the focus of my talk today.
Sorry, may we ask everyone to please mute themselves?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of background. Those of you who are in the UK probably know this already. Since for over a couple of decades or so, at the beginning of this century, there was quite a steady rise in the proportion of EAL pupils that were recorded in primary and secondary schools in England. And since then, the figures have kind of plateaued. At the moment, it's still around 20%. But this is an average, which hides a lot of variability in how these children are kind of distributed, if you want, nationally. So here I'll ask you to focus on the figure on the right. Don't worry if you can't see the small print. It's just about seeing the overall pattern here. What you see is a graph that shows the number of schools, so vertically, the higher the bar, the more schools, according to the proportion of EAL pupils that are in that school. And so you can see that there's a lot of schools with hardly any EAL pupils. And then there's a long tail going to close to 100%, with a very few schools nationally having the highest proportion. And the average is around 20%, okay? Now, there are some pockets across the country where the distribution is quite different, and Bradford is one such pocket. I'm going to talk quite a lot about Bradford today, so I thought it'd be interesting to start with this. So you recognize the kind of shape from the previous graph, but you see that instead of a very long, thin tail, it's quite a thick, long tail, meaning that in Bradford, there's a higher proportion, still relatively modest, but a higher proportion of schools that have, really high percentages of EAL pupils. So if you compare the national average, which is in red here, with the Bradford average, which is higher, that shows you that there's more in Bradford, but it also masks this reality of some schools with really a majority of students being EAL. So if we put together the information from these two graphs, in a nutshell, we can say that nationally, most schools have 10% or less EAL pupils, but in Bradford, most schools have 50% or more EAL pupils. So today, having set this context, I would like to, as I said earlier, zoom in on the individual differences among bilingual children. And to get us started, I thought I would give you 3 profiles of children and ask you to, I don't know what that 7 is doing there, but anyway, ignore that 7. Hopefully there's no other typo, but ask you to think for yourself, who do you think is more bilingual? The aim of this little question is to get you started to think about the criteria that you use when you compare the children. So this is likely to raise a number of additional questions, and hopefully the rest of the talk will provide answers to these questions. So I'm going to stop talking for a couple of minutes while you read these profiles and think for yourselves who you think is more bilingual. Okay, so hopefully you've had the chance to read about these 3 profiles. You might have strong views about who's more bilingual or who is less bilingual. You might be completely hesitant to classify those children. If you like, we can come back to this in the question period. What I would like to do now is to, on the basis of the questions I believe you've asked yourself when trying to answer the question of who is more bilingual, look into some detail at the variation between children that we observe in children who are local to me here, so in North Yorkshire, okay? So to summarize, to give you a little preview of aspects we're going to look at, we're going to focus on the how we can measure bilingualism and how children might vary again along all these different dimensions. So one way would be to look at how well children are able to use each of their languages. And so that would be in terms of understanding these languages while listening, speaking them, reading them, perhaps writing them. And within these different types of modalities, we could look at different aspects of proficiency. We could look at grammar, so syntax, morphology. We could look at vocabulary. We could look at fluency, at accent, at communication, so discourse pragmatics, for instance. So these are various ways in which we could measure how bilingual children are in how well they use each language. Another way would be to look at how much experience children have had in each language. So what is their community of interlocutors? Is it very small, just mom or just dad, or is it bigger? What range of contexts are they exposed to or using these languages? What activities do they do? How often? How have things changed in terms of language experience over their lifetime? Have they had formal education in each language? And then finally, we could look at measuring bilingualism in terms of the attitudes towards the language, and perhaps that would mean the extent to which the child identifies to each language. And in this case, the societal status of each language might have an impact. So in the talk, as promised in the abstract, I'm going to talk about children from North Yorkshire from 3 studies. 2 are ongoing, so the number of children isn't super high yet, and 1 that is completed. And I'm going to compare the children who are roughly at key stage 1, so that's the beginning of primary school in the UK. Normally it's up to 7, but I've included 8-year-olds in this broad classification. And children at key stage 3, so that's the beginning of primary school, secondary school in the UK. Okay? The children from the primary school cohort come all from North Yorkshire, various locations, and the children from the key stage 3 study, secondary school, are all from Bradford. And if you put together all the, I would say, heritage languages or home languages that these children are bilingual in, it includes 49 different languages that are listed here. So that's just to show you the huge variability that there is in terms of heritage languages spoken by EAL pupils, even in such a tiny data sample. So in the talk, I will frequently show you figures that compare key stage 1 with key stage 3. Of course, they're not the same children at different time intervals. They are different children. So this isn't directly showing the effect of time, but hopefully it's going to be a reasonably good approximation for it. Okay, so we will look at group differences, but our main interest is going to be variation within groups, so the individual differences. The first thing I would like to show you is how language dominance changes so over time, with the caveat that I've just said. So to read this this graph, you need to first know that each dot represents a child, an individual child. And you see the 2 red lines. I think they're a bit faint, but the red lines are the cutoff point between children who are dominant in English, so that's those that show above the line, or in the home language. So the higher the dot, the more dominant in English, the lower the dot, the more dominant in the other language. And you see that there's bulges, and that shows, you know, where there's concentration of children. So there's lots of children at this level of dominance in English, for instance, here. Okay, now we see for each group of children, we see their current dominance, and we see their cumulative dominance. And so based on how much language they hear, okay? So the current dominance is, you know, what is the proportion of English that they are exposed to at the time of the study? And the cumulative values are looking at the same thing, but over the child's lifetime. So if the child has had a period of being monolingual in not English, so whatever heritage language is at home, they are likely to have, to be still dominant in that language when they start secondary school. So what we see, for instance, in the Key Stage 1 part of the graph is that over their lifetime, many children have had more experience in the home language, but at the time of the study, many of them have already become dominant in English. And for Key Stage 3, we see that over their lifetime, very few children had had more experience in the heritage language, and that at the time of the study, most of them are very dominant in English. So we see that there's a kind of a trend here that as children grow up in monolingual English education, they become more dominant in English. Another way of looking at, it's something related to dominance, but it's a dimension of it, you could say, is the extent to which children might be passive in their heritage language. By passive, I mean that the child sometimes responds, it's the extent to which the child responds in the societal language, so here English, when addressed in the home language, in the heritage language. So here you see in the two graphs, you see that each time a dot is a child, and the higher the dot, the more the child is passive in the home language. So the ones that are at the top here, they always answer back in English when they are addressed in the home language. Okay, and the ones at the bottom, they never answer in English when they are addressed in the home language. To the left of the red line, we see children who hear the heritage language less than half of the time. So those are dominant in English. And further to the right, the furthest to the right, the more the child hears the heritage language and could be dominant in the heritage language. Okay, so this is what we saw vertically in the previous slide. And we see this in both age groups. So the more the child hears the heritage language, the less they are likely to be passive in the heritage language. And if they are, it will be to a lesser extent. But it's important to see that this isn't a completely straight, thin line. There's a lot of spread here. So that shows that children who don't hear much of the heritage language are not necessarily passive. There's quite a variety between them. Okay. Another way still to look at a related aspect of this reality of language dominance and perhaps passivity or receptive bilingualism is looking at language mixing. So here we see represented in colors the frequency with which the person, so either the child or other people, so that could be the adults or the friends or the siblings, so with the extent to which they answer in a different language. So usually it's going to be answering in the more dominant language when addressed in the other language. Okay, and so you can see that things that are in this color range, so blue, green, yellow, that's relatively often. So you see that in the home, the children in so this is a small sample. This is a current study for Key Stage 1. You can see that the children do quite a lot of answering in the other language, much more in the home than outside the home. But interestingly, you see that others around them also do quite a lot of language mixing, more in the home than outside the home, probably because the home is where a lot of the diversity is observed, whereas in the outside world, there might be some contexts where it's not possible to use the heritage language. So far we've looked at language dominance in terms of how much experience a child has had or is having in each language. But here we're looking at language dominance based on proficiency. I've chosen to not include literacy because some of the heritage languages in our sample do not have a written version. And at the moment, we don't document very well other types, so non-written literacy activity. So I've focused on just oracy here. So here what you see is, so based on parental estimates of their child's ability in each language, so speaking and understanding while listening, you can see the difference between the two languages. So above the red line, so on the red line would be the children who are equally good in both languages, the home language and the societal language. And above the line, you can see that there's a lot of children here in our sample in Key Stage 1. So these are the children who are more proficient in English, okay? And those who are below, they are more proficient in the heritage language. So you see that the number of children who are more proficient in the heritage language really dwindles in secondary school, and that already from the beginning of primary school, children tend to be stronger in English already on average. Okay, so we observe the same trend, but interestingly, at secondary school, there's still quite a number of balanced bilinguals. So we could ask then, does language dominance predict English proficiency? So here in these graphs, I'm showing you the results of a grammar proficiency test. It's a sentence repetition test. So the idea is that if you're able to repeat sentences in increasing level of difficulty in terms of morphosyntax, that's because you have acquired those features. So it's the same test, but it's coded differently. So here we code for whether the child was able to repeat a particular grammatical aspect of the sentence correctly. And here, if we use that coding, most children would be at ceiling. So we use whether the child is able to do an absolutely identical repetition of the sentence. So it's a bit of a meaner coding, if you want, which partly explains why the results are a bit lower. So, okay, so the higher the dot, again, each child is a dot. The higher the dot, the better the performance of the child in the test. And then you can see again this red line, including, so this is balanced children. Those who are dominant in English will be to the right of the line, those dominant in the heritage language to the left. And then you see the blue line here representing the relationship between these two aspects, so the proficiency and language dominance. So what do we see? If we look at the top performing children, those that are at the top of the graph here, you can see that there's quite a bunching up in those who are highly dominant in English. But, you know, there's quite a lot of children who are dominant in the heritage language and who nonetheless achieve the same high scores. So the effect that we see, you know, is there. The line isn't horizontal, but it's not far from horizontal. So it's a modest trend. So that means that, yeah, dominance is not the strongest predictor for proficiency in English. Now, in Key Stage 3, we see the same type of trend, at least, but yeah, a little bit, but with quite a bit of variability. But what is important here, and was surprised and I think quite sad for us to find out, is that, you know, at this age range, we wouldn't expect performance to be so low overall. So there's likely to be effect of you know, challenging factors for the children. So most likely deprivation, because this was from some of the poorest schools in the country, and also combined with a lot of missing schools during the pandemic. So the children in this cohort missed a lot of school at the last year of primary school and in the first year of secondary school. So factors other than language dominance are likely to play an important role. So you might think the earlier, the better. The earlier you start acquiring the language, maybe the better your performance would be. So again, looking at the same test, we're going to look at these results in a number of slides here. You can see again, the higher the dot, the better the performance of the child, the lower the worst. And here on the horizontally, you see at what age, expressed in month, was the child first exposed to English. So the children who are at 0 here, that means that they were exposed from birth to both their home language and English, I mean, their heritage language and English. But you see that some children, so, you know, the children in this study are not that much older than 60 months old. They started being exposed to English when very close to or when they started primary school. So what do we see here? Again, this is the effect, and you see that it's quite a, it's not a straight line. So you would expect to have something that descends like that if age of exposure had a strong impact. It does have an effect. So there's a trend for the earlier the better, but there is, as you see, a lot of variability between the children. And again, the same is observed even at key stage 3. So so here I would like to have a little parenthesis about what the scientific literature tells us about is earlier better. So there's quite a few studies and some emerging ones showing that later exposure to the societal language can lead to better proficiency in the heritage language, because the child starts with a monolingual period in the heritage language. And because they, and then, so that's for in the heritage language. But later exposure to the societal language does not necessarily result in lower proficiency in the societal language. So even though the children, are going to be far behind when they start school, they can catch up. Research also shows that there's some subtle aspects of language that are harder to acquire after a certain age, even in children. But there's a strong consensus that, it's not just about the age of acquisition. What matters just as much is the amount of experience. So the amount of experience is at least as important, if not more, than the age of acquisition. And that's what we're going to look at now. So again, looking at the same tests of proficiency, here we see that there is a relationship. You can see here the line is a little bit steeper, especially in the younger children, showing the relationship between proficiency, as we've seen, and the cumulative exposure to English. So that's when you add all the amount of time that the child has been exposed to English and expressed as a percentage over the lifetime. So so to the right of the line, again, dominant in English, and at key stage 1, I've shown, you don't see it in this graph here, but I've shown in a recent paper that children with at least 60% of exposure to English over the lifetime tended to have caught up with their monolingual peers in terms of proficiency. Okay, so it's really important to notice also that it is possible to perform very well in this test, even if you are not, dominant in the heritage language. And at key stage 3, we also see that children with more experience of English tend to do better, but not necessarily. And that some children with a lot of experience of English nonetheless do quite poorly in these tests. So these are children for whom there certainly is a concern. So just to add then one more dimension to what matters in predicting language proficiency, there is also the quality of the experience. And here it's more difficult to show you it with graphs from the data from this cohort, so I'm going to refer to the literature mainly. So quality, so I've put it into quotation marks because it's a bit of a controversial term, depends on the diversity and the number of interlocutors. It depends on, so the more the better. It depends on the presence of all the siblings. So for instance, all the siblings, especially if they speak the societal language at home, have been shown to have quite a strong effect on the proficiency of the younger siblings in the societal language. The education of parents, the socioeconomic status of the family also have a strong impact. And then also whether the child is literate in the language or not. So these factors have a particularly strong impact on the heritage language because there isn't the leveling effect of school. And so here, because most of you are interested in Spanish here, I've highlighted the conclusions of a recent study based in the States on Spanish English bilinguals, showing that heritage language proficiency was higher if there was more experience with friends and in reading, so these friends and reading here, and less through the family, so that means more heritage language maintenance in the family, and the later age of language of English acquisition, so a period of monolingual Spanish acquisition. And something I won't have the time to talk about in the talk, but you can ask me later if you like, is that there was a strong cultural identification with the heritage language, which is predicted by the proficiency in the heritage language. So we've done a whistle tour of lots of dimensions that can be used to define bilingualism. And we've seen that bilingualism is everything but a binary distinction. It is really a gradient with many dimensions, including the experience of each language in terms of quantity, quality, level of language mixing, in terms of proficiency in each language, in terms of passivity in each language, and in terms of language dominance, which of course is defined based on these other aspects. So there's many dimensions which are associated with each other and which change also over time, especially in children. So over the past few decades, we have really we've started moving away as a field of research on bilingualism from the scaremongering attitudes towards bilingualism that were quite common in Western societies a few decades ago, especially when I was little, and these are becoming much rarer now. So there is recognition that multilingual children have as much vocabulary as monolingual children. It's just that in most cases it is distributed across between their languages. There's a number of studies that show that bilingualism can have many advantages, and here I think it's important to say can rather than does, because there is some variation, unfortunately, between children in that respect as well, and that apparent delays in the societal language are normal, especially when the children haven't been exposed to it long yet, and that most children will catch up with standard support. So this is what I would like to focus on for the last part of the talk, where we're going to look at bilingualism in the school context. And in the children that we've been talking about so far, all of them are in monolingual schools, at least in terms of the language of teaching, which is English. So so our focus here is, if you like, the teacher's perspective. So they see all this variety in their classroom, and their concern is who is going to just catch up naturally and who needs help. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the results from the learning achievements of children, comparing monolinguals in pale blue with bilinguals, EL in dark blue. And these are the levels of education. So this is early years, so before primary school. This is the first and second levels of primary school, and this is the end of secondary school. So this is when there's national exams measuring pupils' development. And so here we are comparing monolingual and EL children for each time taking for 10. So when you take 10 children, 10 monolingual children who achieve good levels of overall development at school, what is the number of EL pupils who do, as a kind of a proportion? Okay, that doesn't mean that all the monolinguals achieve those levels, right? That's another question. Here we're just comparing for 10 who do, in the monolinguals, how many do in the EL? And so you see that at the beginning, out of 10, there's 6, a bit more than 6 who do in the bilingual children. And then you can see that this gap progressively closes as children go through the education system. So the the achievement gap seems to be due to English proficiency, right? So the more children become proficient in English, the more they catch up with their monolingual peers, okay? And research by the same team here, Strand, Malberg, and Hall, have shown that EL children who are fluent in English tend to achieve higher scores than monolinguals in at least some subjects at school. So the conclusion here is that EL can be a challenge early on, but it can turn into an advantage, and that most children catch up, but not all children catch up, right? So, so the question that schools have in relation to EL pupils is, who needs extra support? So more than what is provided standardly in the classroom. And this is particularly important because, you know, where the home language environment is impoverished, it isn't the parents who are going to be able to, you know, provide extra support. This is really the role of education settings, including schools, nurseries, etc. But for that, professionals need to have appropriate expectations of where the child should be based on the language experience that they've had so far. Okay, and for that, what I'm arguing here is that without a good understanding of the variability among bilingual children, it is impossible to identify children who are at risk of language disorders. Okay, so with colleagues from France, the UK, and the Netherlands, we have designed a new online tool for teachers. Actually, I'm just going to talk about teachers here, but it's also for other professional groups. It's an online questionnaire that for parents to fill in, and which exists in many different languages in case English is difficult for the parents. I will show you a couple of snapshots. Actually, no, one screenshot only of part of the questionnaire to show you that it's quite an intuitive interface that requires minimal levels of numeracy, because, you know, what we want to know is how much experience a child has had, and the parents have to recollect over, you know, previous periods. So it can be quite tricky, but I'll show you how we've done that. And it produces individual reports for each child automatically. So here's an example of a couple of questions from the questionnaire. You can see here at the top, I need to move things out of the way. You can see here we ask parents to report on different language-defined periods in the child's life. So ages at which something changed in the child's language experience. So for instance, it might be when they started nursery, or when they started school, or maybe they moved from one country to the other. This is particularly interesting for new arrivals, so refugee children who might have had all sorts of periods that defined language experience over their lifetime. And then for each period, parents are asked for the languages that they've said the child had been exposed to. They are asked to adjust this pie chart by moving the sliders here to show how much of each language the child has been exposed to for each of the periods in turn. So that's the only bit of the questionnaire I'm going to show you, just to explain how intuitive, I mean, the extent to which we've managed to make it intuitive. And then I thought I would show you just a little snapshot of what the report looks like. So this is something that's generated automatically once the parents have filled in the questionnaire. The parents don't see it, it's the professional who sees it, so the teacher. And so what do we have here? We have so the child's age, etc., the languages that they're exposed to in the home, where they were born, how many siblings, who the caregivers are, and what languages they use, when they started being exposed to each language, and how much experience they have had of each language, how much they speak over their lifetime. We asked if there was parental concerns in the early language development, because that's a really reliable indicator of whether they might be at risk of developmental language disorders, any school periods that were missed. So of course there's the pandemic, unfortunately recently, but it could be that a child has had periods of illness, or for refugee children, they might have missed a lot of education. And then here we look at the current experience in the language, that's overall, and that is looking at how it is distributed across contexts. So you can see that at school, this child here has a completely English experience. At home, quite a lot of, Polish. And then you can see that in the holidays, there's also quite a lot more Polish than usual. Then we have a richness score it's a global measure of the richness of the language experience that includes the types of, how many different types of activities and at what frequency does a child do in each language, and do they have literacy, and do they have formal learning in each language. And then at the end, you see we have an estimate of the language proficiency the child's proficiency in each language. And then we also give a number of guidelines to help teachers interpret the results. So we believe this is necessary for teachers to have realistic expectations as to whether the child should or shouldn't have already caught up with the monolinguals in the class, or whether they need extra help or not. So they might need to be referred to a speech language therapist, for instance. So this study is still ongoing. We are, so the study where we created this questionnaire, we are currently in the validation phase. So if you live in the UK or in France or in the Netherlands, and that you have a child who's between 5 and 9 years old, you might like to participate in our study. That would be fantastic. Please email us. Maybe you're a teacher in the UK who would be interested in participating in our validation study, or or in the Netherlands or in France, or maybe you are a teacher interested in bilingualism, and so we would like to hear from you. So before closing, I would like to thank all my wonderful collaborators, those from the Cubex team, that's for study 2, Lydia from the research assistant on the study 3, and Sana, who was the research assistant on the study 1. So I'd like to thank the participating schools, the parents and the children. I'd like to thank our funders. And I thought I would highlight the fact that all the illustrations in the talk were generated by artificial intelligence using the little URL there. So that's why there was no copyright anywhere. I just generated those from words. And then finally, I would like to put a little plug here for a wonderful podcast on bilingualism that you might be, if you were interested in the issues that I've discussed today and more, that you might like to have a go at. It is really fantastic. So klets means chatterbox. So it was in Dutch. It's a podcast that is curated by Sharon Unsworth. So that's it. I think I've spoken for long enough, hopefully not too long, and I look forward to your questions.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
This study that you have been doing with the families and with the tools that you have developed, there are already projects in practice where the teachers of the schools are putting in practice your advice. There is analysis, which is, I guess, it's rather complicated because it's not only bilingual or multilingualism, but children for very different cultural backgrounds. Could you explain or tell us about the experience, how the teachers, if they are working already with the tools and the reports you produce with it, and the results that they are having? Thank you. Okay, so so the teachers who find out about our tool say that it's exactly what they need. So to inform their practice. But we've had
with the current pressures that teachers have been facing during and since the pandemic, we've found it very difficult to find enough people to engage in doing focus groups with us to see how we can, enhance the reports so that they meet optimally the needs of teachers. So you see, for instance, something that we would like to develop, that we are developing at the moment with the validation study, is to look for clear guidance on what the threshold of cumulative exposure a child has to have had to have caught up with their monolingual peers. So at the moment, we've got that from one small-scale study in the UK, and we're trying to do that internationally. So so to answer your question, yes, so far positive, but still a lot of, how to exactly implement that in the schools, so far we have had more success when doing continuous professional development workshops, or when we engage with trainee teachers who will, hopefully start embedding the tool in their practice. So that's why you see I have this call at the end of the talk. If there are teachers among you, if you know teachers who would be interested, we need to have more collaborating with us in this last year of the project.
Thank you very much. Some questions from our audience, maybe?
Oh, I'm really sorry, my internet died.
No problem, no problem.
We have stormy weather in Asturias, and I had to reboot the whole thing, plus I got internet installed today. Anyway, sorry about that, Cecile. I couldn't see the very last seconds. So I'm not sure if there were any questions already going on.
Yes, I have put a question to Dr. De Cat, Professor De Cat, and I also invited the audience if they had some questions about this very, very interesting lecture, which I guess also that is something very rather innovative, in the sense that I don't know, or maybe it's my lack of knowledge, that there are not so many studies with this accuracy and this working together with teachers in the school.
I can see that there's some questions appearing in the chat here. So somebody's asking if the questionnaire is free to use. Yes, it is. So all you need to do is to go on the website. So I'm going to put the URL in the chat here. So there you go, cubex.org. So you just need to go there, and then you register. Unfortunately, it takes a day to make sure, because we need to check that you are a real person and all the rest of it. And then you get access to the interface where you can actually, I didn't say that, but you can actually customize the questionnaire quite a lot. So if you're a researcher, you might like to customize it quite substantially. So if you put the whole thing in, it's very long. It's best to choose the components you're interested in the most. So what else was there? Yes, so some people commented on who they thought was the most bilingual. Somebody said the three of them are the most bilingual. Like that. So you see that there is no simple answer to the question of which of the three children that I showed you the fictitious profiles of is more bilingual. It depends on how it is defined. So the one who's the most passive in her language, perhaps she could be argued to be the least bilingual of all of them. But what I haven't put in that text is how much it defines her in terms of her identity. Maybe it's very important for her, and maybe she would consider herself to be strongly bilingual. So yeah, we can discuss that more if any of you like.
Right. It's interesting that one of our viewers touches on the topic of the one who started the two languages first as being the most bilingual of all, right? Well, that's, I guess, if we defined bilingualism in the traditional European sense of early bilinguals, right? Native bilinguals who were raised speaking both languages simultaneously. But it depends on the conception, I guess.
Well, it depends on many things, as I've tried to show in the talk. Like, you know, for instance, my child was exposed to both languages from birth, but he's so dominant in English. You know, it is really about, you know, he doesn't have enough of a French-speaking community around him. So, yeah. So you see, out of the three profiles, the one who is probably the more balanced, so with equal proficiency in both languages, is likely to be Gracian, the Polish kid, because he had a period of monolingual, of being monolingual Polish at the beginning. Yeah. So somebody asked, why does a project focus on children over 5? Yes, so the questionnaire is suitable for children from the onset of expressive language, really, expressive syntax. So from 2 years of age. Otherwise, before that, it's best to use questionnaire that are designed specially for infants. So why does a project focus on children over 5? That's because, you know, we had to be realistic in terms of the number of children we would be able to collect data from for the validation. And because we are mainly interested, well, one of the main questions we're interested in is in this threshold question, so for teachers, so how much and speech language therapists, how much exposure, how much experience in the societal language does the child need to have caught up with monolinguals? We needed to focus on what we believe being around that bracket. So we believe it that from, you know, 8 or so years of age, the cumulative amount of exposure is no longer strongly predictive. So we needed to go from 5 to almost 9. That's why. I hope that answers your question, Anna.
Nancy has an additional question. When can you introduce an additional heritage language as language 3 for those families that consist of mixed ethnic households, basically?
Yes. So in this sample, I was trying to keep the talk simple enough. In this sample, I haven't said, but quite a lot of the kids are trilingual. And there's a lot of variability in our 3 samples in terms of how many children are trilingual. But for most of them, the second heritage language, to call it that, is much weaker than the other languages. So there's much less exposure. Proficiency tends to be really low. Of course, it will depend on the children's profile. So again, refugee children might be more likely to have 2 very strong heritage languages. Yeah. So I'm not sure what your question is, because you say when can you introduce? Yeah, there is no rule, right? So in very multilingual societies, like for instance in India, children are introduced to many languages at the same time, perhaps 5 or something, and they manage fine. So yeah, we need to study these very multilingual societies more to dispel some of the myths that we have in our much too monolingual societies. Somebody asked for my email, so yes. There you go. But if you're interested in exchanging or participating in our project, you can also use the QBEX email address, which I'm gonna put here. So if you know, so if you have kids who are in that age bracket, and that they are exposed to the societal language that's either English, French, or Dutch, We would love to hear from you because we're still recruiting. You know, with the pandemic, it's been horrendously difficult to get participants. Okay, somebody asks.
What is your opinion about language schools for newcomers? In the Netherlands, newcomers with no previous knowledge of the dominant language, for instance, Dutch, in the case of the Netherlands, right, go to language school for 1 or 2 years, and afterwards they move to mainstream schools.
I have no opinion because I don't know enough about these schools and about, you know, how they've been. Yeah, so I think if there is really good support in a mainstream school, as there very often is, I find, you know, with the schools that we've been working with, you know, a lot of the practice is just absolutely admirable. If there is good support, there is, you know, I don't think there is necessarily a need for a special school, because the risk perhaps is that the child might, you know, integrate less quickly in the society. But equally, you know, people sometimes say, "Oh, children, you know, they are like sponges; they learn it very quickly and naturally." I don't think that's true. I think all children need support. You know, another argument perhaps for going mainstream is that it's been found repeatedly in many settings that the monolingual children benefit enormously from the language support given for the bilingual children. So that would be another reason to perhaps keep them together and give stronger language support for everyone. But as I said, you know, I don't know this Dutch system. It might be absolutely fantastic. So I wouldn't want to criticize it as I don't know any of it.
Right. So Anna comments that many years ago, it used to be the case in the UK as well. They used to go to an after-school club where the main focus was English in order to catch up with the peer group. I don't know if you have comments on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, you know, after-school clubs that focus on language, but that are inclusive of everyone would be fab. Something I tried to get funding for a few years ago and then gave up because didn't manage, was to do a drama-based intervention, language intervention, that would be, you know, as an after-school club, something really, you know, exciting and rewarding and confidence building, but based on language. So I think after-school clubs are brilliant. What is tricky is, you know, when the child is taken out of lessons or remedial language lessons. So, you know, maybe they need them. I mean, for sure, if that's the case, that they need them, but then the risk, I guess, is that they miss more and more of the standard lesson. I think it's you know, these are extremely complex questions, and I don't feel qualified to adjudicate.
That's fair enough. Fair enough. So, okay, there is a qualification by Anna. Sorry, it's not after school club as such. I can't remember the name. My dissertation was about EAL children and reading literature, and I learned that. Okay, so it was a different name, but you know, basically the underlying philosophy should be the same, right?
Yeah. But I think, you know, the main point I would like to say is that really, you know, the more support, the more language support is provided, not just that by specialist teachers, but by all teachers, the more everyone benefits. So not just the EAL, but the other children as well.
Absolutely. So I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment, but if anybody would like to unmute themselves and just ask a question orally, you're welcome to do so as well. And if not, Pedro Sebio Cuesta may have some remarks to make.
I only have to congratulate Professor De Cat. It was really fantastic lecture. And we have seen that we can have the experience of seeing that how complex and how enriching is the bilingualism. And in that sense, we are very happy to have you tonight. And thank you, Julio, again for this wonderful program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.